On a late-night drive down an empty road, Jack begins to notice an eerie presence behind him. No matter how fast he drives, the headlights remain unnervingly close. As the darkness around him grows heavier, he realizes he's being followed by something far more sinister than just another driver. The road to nowhere. The late-night drive should have been uneventful, a simple routine that Jack had taken countless times before. The engine hummed steadily under the hood of his car, and the faint glow from the dashboard illuminated his tired face. He glanced at the clock, noting the time, almost 2 a.m. His mind wandered, drifting between thoughts of his work week, the frustrations, and the exhaustion that seemed to have seeped into his bones. The road before him stretched endlessly into the dark expanse of the night. The thick canopy of trees on either side of him swallowed any sign of life, making the world outside seem as if it didn't exist. The headlights barely cut through the blackness, revealing only what was immediately in front of him. Jack wasn't sure why he always took this particular route when driving home. Maybe because it was faster, or maybe because it felt like it had always been there. This road, though, was different. It didn't seem like a place people lived near. No towns, no lights, just the road and the forest surrounding it. He reached for his phone on the passenger seat, a moment of distraction. The GPS was set to the usual path, nothing out of the ordinary. The silence in the car was deafening, but Jack didn't mind. It gave him time to think. He turned the radio dial to drown out the silence. Static filled the speakers, and Jack frowned, his hand going back to the dial. Nothing but static. Stupid signal, Jack muttered, rolling the dial back to the off position. The quiet returned, only more oppressive now. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another set of headlights behind him. There was none. A slight relief filled him for a second, but then, like a flicker in the corner of his vision, he thought he saw something in the distance. Just a small glimmer. The headlights. He blinked and turned his gaze back to the mirror. There they were, 2 lights dim, far behind him. He hadn't noticed them before. A car, but not close enough to be in his lane, just far enough to be visible. It didn't make sense. This was a lonely road with no side exits. There were no cars here at this time of night. Jack felt his muscles tense, but he shook the unease away. It was probably just another driver on the same road. After all, this wasn't a major highway. It was a local route, but still, the idea of someone else driving along felt unsettling. The light stayed the same distance behind him, almost as if it was keeping pace with him. Okay, Jack muttered, glancing at the GPS again. Maybe I'm just imagining it. This road messes with your mind. He reached for his water bottle, unscrewing the cap, and took a long drink. When he looked back up, the lights were still there. He swallowed hard, his throat dry now. Something wasn't right. He wasn't being paranoid, he was sure of it. Jack's foot pressed down harder on the gas pedal, the engine's roar breaking the silence, but still, the car behind him followed. No matter how fast he drove, the headlights remained at the same distance, never coming closer, but never fading either. The unease he felt only intensified, and he found himself glancing nervously in the rearview mirror every few seconds. But it was still just those same headlights. Nothing more. The dark forest loomed on either side, and Jack was aware of how isolated he was. There wasn't a single other car on this stretch of road. No signs of life. Only the steady thrum of his car's tires on the pavement. He tried to push the unease out of his mind. It was just a car. Just another driver on the road. But the headlights behind him never wavered, never faltered. It was as if the car was glued to his rear bumper, tracking his every move. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel, and his mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe they were headed in the same direction. But somehow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. That someone was watching him. He glanced at the mirror again, his gaze hardening, as if willing the car behind him to just pass him, to move forward or disappear. But it remained. Right there. Staring him down. Come on, Jack muttered, his grip on the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles turn white. He pressed down harder on the gas pedal, willing the car to speed up and put distance between him and the strange driver. But even as he pushed the accelerator to the floor, the headlights remained locked in place. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered. Jack's eyes widened in panic. Not now, not now. He smacked the steering wheel with his palm, trying to get the engine to cooperate, but it sputtered again, and the headlights of the car behind him flickered in his mirror, as if responding to the trouble. For a brief moment, The headlights of the car behind him went out completely, and Jack's heart jumped to his throat. He had a split second to wonder if maybe it was all in his head, but then the headlights flared back to life, brighter, harsher, and far too close. They were no longer behind him, but beside him. Something had changed. Jack's breath quickened as the lights flared brighter, and in his peripheral vision, he thought he saw a shadow move, a figure inside the other car. A figure watching him. It felt like someone was staring directly at him from within the darkened vehicle. He couldn't bring himself to look directly at the figure. It was too much, too chilling. In the reflection of the window, the shadow seemed to shift. It wasn't just a figure. It was an outline. A face. No, two faces right beside him. They weren't inside the other car, though. They were in his car. Behind him. Jack's heart froze. He didn't dare to look back, but he couldn't help it. Slowly, his eyes moved to the rearview mirror, and as if his gaze had summoned it, the figure emerged. Just a faint silhouette in the shadows, but undeniably there. The face stared back at him, eyes hollow, mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. The chase begins. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as the headlights behind him grew closer. At first, he thought it was just another car on the road, but the strange intensity of the lights made his heart race. The vehicle trailing him seemed to have no intention of passing. Instead, it stuck to him like glue, hovering just behind his car, no matter how fast or slow he drove. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time, the lights were too close. He could barely make out the shape of the car, a shadow in the dark, its headlights cutting through the night like a beacon. It was a dark, desolate stretch of road, and the only sounds were the hum of his engine and the pounding of his heart. Stay calm, Jack muttered under his breath, trying to reassure himself. Maybe it's just another driver. Maybe they're just going the same way. But as he accelerated, the car behind him did the same. It wasn't just coincidence. The chase had begun. His heart pounded louder in his chest as he swerved the wheel, trying to shake off the car behind him. The headlights flickered, the light from the other car reflecting off the road in eerie patterns. It felt like the car was intentionally matching his every move. No matter what Jack did, speed up, slow down, take a sharp turn, the black vehicle behind him stayed right there, just out of reach, its presence a constant reminder that something was wrong. Jack slammed his foot down harder on the gas, the engine roaring louder, but the black car still kept up, as if mocking his desperation. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his breath shallow and erratic. The night outside was thick and oppressive, the dark trees lining the road seeming to close in, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward his car. The speedometer ticked higher, but his fear grew faster than his speed. He turned his head to glance behind him again, but this time, the headlights seemed to vanish, completely gone, as if they'd never existed. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He slowed down, looking around in confusion. No headlights. No car. Just the empty road stretching before him. The night was as still as death itself, but the eerie silence only made the dread inside him grow. What had just happened? Had he imagined the whole thing? Just as he was about to breathe a sigh of relief, a sudden, sharp laugh rang out. It wasn't the sound of a person laughing. No, it was distorted, echoing through the air like a malevolent presence. Jack's blood ran cold. It came from somewhere behind him, but there was no car in sight. The laugh grew louder, like it was inside the car with him, surrounding him from all sides. He turned to look at the back seat, but it was empty, as it should have been. Still, the voice continued, low, guttural, and menacing. Jack's heart raced even faster now. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who's there?" he called out shakily, but his voice came out as nothing more than a hoarse whisper. Suddenly, the headlights reappeared in his rearview mirror, but they were different this time. They weren't like the typical headlights of a car. They were piercing, unnatural, almost glowing with an eerie intensity. And they were much closer now. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he slammed his foot on the gas again. His tires screeched against the asphalt, and his car shot forward like a missile. But the lights stayed with him, never fading, never moving away. His speed increased, but the pursuing car never lagged behind. It stayed there, always close, always watching him. The road twisted ahead, sharp turns and narrow curves making it impossible for Jack to outrun the vehicle. It felt like the road itself was designed to trap him. Every time he tried to escape, the chase only grew more intense. He turned the wheel sharply to the left, hoping to throw the car off his trail. But when he looked up, the headlights had shifted positions. They were now directly in front of him. He jerked the wheel to the right, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision with the unseen car. Sweat poured down his face as the black vehicle followed him with an unnatural precision. The road was getting narrower, and the trees on either side seemed to close in tighter, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the pavement. A cold wind began to whip around him, howling through the cracks in his window. The temperature inside the car dropped, and his breath came out in visible clouds. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. And then, just when Jack thought he couldn't take it anymore, the headlights disappeared again. But this time, it wasn't like before. This time, the darkness around him felt thicker. It was like the very air was closing in on him, pressing down on him with an almost suffocating force. The trees seemed to grow taller, their limbs twisting and reaching like monstrous hands. Jack's heart thundered in his chest, but he didn't dare stop. He couldn't. He had to keep driving. He had to escape whatever was chasing him. He pushed the car faster, his hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. The road seemed endless now, the horizon a dark, unyielding void. There was no escape. Suddenly, he saw something up ahead, a faint flicker of light in the distance. It looked like a house, maybe a gas station, anything to break the isolation, to break the terror. Jack's mind screamed for him to go toward it, but as he drew closer, the lights flickered and vanished, replaced by an eerie, pitch-black void. He was alone again. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty, but the sense of being watched, being hunted, was stronger than ever. The voice, the distorted laugh, echoed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just mocking him. It was warning him. "Don't stop, Jack," it whispered, sending a wave of icy dread through his bones. "Keep driving. You'll never escape." The eyes in the dark. Jack's hands trembled as they gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles now bone white. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep driving. The fear gnawing at him was like a living thing, curling around his chest and squeezing, making it hard to breathe. The road ahead was nothing but a dark void, stretching endlessly, and the unsettling laugh still echoed in his ears. No matter how fast he drove, it felt as though the darkness was swallowing him whole. The trees around him seemed to move, bending toward the car, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The headlights that had once vanished reappeared again, this time, even closer than before. Jack could barely make out the shape of the car behind him, but he could feel its presence like a weight pressing on his back. It wasn't just a car anymore. It felt like something far more sinister, something that didn't belong on the road with him. He could almost feel it staring at him, watching, waiting. Panic rose in Jack's chest as he took another sharp turn, hoping to lose the car. But every time he looked up, the headlights were still there, never fading, never losing ground. It was as though the pursuing car was always one step ahead of him, anticipating his every move. In a desperate bid to escape, Jack took the next exit. The road was narrower, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in even further. The ground beneath the tires rumbled, and the car seemed to sink lower into the dirt, but the headlights never flickered. They remained there, unyielding, relentless. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked in his rearview mirror. What he saw made his stomach churn. There was no car. The headlights were gone, and the road behind him was empty, bathed in nothing but darkness. But something was wrong. He could feel it. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was stronger than ever. Jack's eyes darted to the side of the road, scanning the dense forest around him. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. And then he saw them. Two glowing eyes, staring at him from the shadows. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he slammed his foot on the gas, racing forward, but the eyes remained locked on him, unwavering. The light from his headlights reflected off them, casting an eerie glow in the darkness, like the eyes of a predator hunting its prey. He took another turn, trying to shake the feeling that something was following him, but the eyes were still there, getting closer. It wasn't just the eyes that frightened him now, it was the way they moved, the way they seemed to follow him through the trees, never blinking, never breaking their gaze. The wind picked up, howling around the car, and Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. His hands were slick with sweat, and his mind raced. Was this some kind of twisted joke? A prank? A bad dream? It didn't feel like any of those things. It felt real, too real, and every instinct in Jack's body told him that something was terribly wrong. He glanced back at the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing there. No car. No headlights. Just the empty road. The trees. The eyes. His breath was shallow now, panicking as he pressed the accelerator, pushing the car faster, faster than it should have been able to go on the dirt road. The headlights flickered as he neared a bend, and for a moment, the road ahead seemed to disappear into nothingness. That's when it happened. The car lurched forward, its tires skidding on the loose gravel. Jack slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The world spun as the car went off the road, tumbling over the edge and crashing through the trees. The impact was bone-jarring. His head slammed into the steering wheel, and the world around him spun in an explosion of lights and sounds. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, absolute, suffocating silence. Jack groaned, his body aching, his vision blurry as he struggled to regain his senses. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for the seatbelt, ripping it off with shaking hands. He had to get out. He had to get away. His eyes snapped to the rearview mirror once more, but this time, there was no mistaking it. The eyes were there again. They glowed from the shadows, watching him from the trees, surrounded by the pitch-black forest. They were closer now, so much closer. Jack could feel them burning into him, could feel them crawling under his skin. And then, from the darkness, came a whisper. The same guttural, distorted laugh that had haunted him earlier. It was low and taunting, as though whatever was behind those eyes was savoring his fear. "Now, Jack," the voice whispered, sending chills down his spine. "You can't run anymore. There's nowhere left to hide." Jack's blood ran cold as the voice echoed through the trees. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the sound of his own frantic breathing. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, but his thoughts were a mess, racing with terror. He knew he couldn't stay in the car. The darkness outside was closing in, the eyes getting closer with every passing second. But the woods beyond the wreck seemed even worse. The darkness there was alive, suffocating, hungry. His eyes darted around, searching for the silent forest. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears, the heavy sound drowning out all other noise. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. The eerie eyes in the darkness, those glowing orbs that had haunted him ever since this nightmare began, were still there. They never blinked, never wavered. They simply stared, unblinking and watching. With a desperate, instinctual movement, Jack shoved open the door. The car's interior light flickered weakly, casting a ghostly glow on the wreckage. The engine lay silent, a dull hum from its broken parts. His mind screamed at him to get out, to run, to do something, anything, but his legs felt like lead. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, pulling him back into the darkened vehicle. With great effort, he stumbled out of the car, his legs unsteady, his body aching from the impact. The night air hit his face with a chill that cut through to the bone. He didn't dare turn to look at the car behind him. He couldn't, not with those eyes still watching. Instead, he ran toward the forest, the only way he thought might lead him to safety. The forest was dense. The trees towered overhead, their twisted branches interlocking like fingers in a macabre grasp. Jack's breath became even more labored as he pushed through the underbrush, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs beneath his feet the only sound in the thick, suffocating silence. The deeper he ran into the woods, the more he felt like he was losing himself, like he was being pulled into some vast, empty void. The eyes, those unblinking, glowing eyes, were still there following him. He could sense them, even though he refused to look back. They were just beyond the trees, always in his peripheral vision, never leaving him, always drawing closer. He could feel their presence, like the gaze of something ancient and malevolent, something that thrived on fear. Then came the whisper, the voice that had haunted him since the beginning. "You can't hide from me, Jack." The voice was closer now, almost as if it were coming from the trees themselves, the wind carrying it in soft waves. Jack froze, his feet rooted to the ground. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry like cotton. His heart hammered against his chest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In that moment, Jack realized that whatever was chasing him wasn't just following him. It was in the forest itself. The trees, the air, the very ground beneath his feet, it was all part of it. He was no longer on the road. He was in its domain, and he had no idea how to escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted, the earth cracking and splitting like the jaws of some massive beast. Jack yelped in surprise as he stumbled back, his heart leaping into his throat. His foot slipped, and he tumbled to the ground, his hands hitting the cold dirt, the sharp sting of branches scraping across his skin. He scrambled to his feet, panic now flooding his every sense. But as he looked around, something felt off. The forest didn't look the same as it had moments ago. The trees that had once towered over him now seemed to stretch impossibly high into the sky, their branches twisting and writhing like serpents. The dark shadows cast by the trees weren't just shadows. They seemed to move, bending and shifting in unnatural ways. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. A chorus of distorted, hollow voices rising from the darkness, murmuring, chanting, whispering his name. Jack! 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 He turned quickly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any indication that anyone, was out there. But all he saw were the shifting shadows and the twisted shapes of the trees, bending inward toward him, closer, closer. A scream ripped from Jack's throat as he bolted forward, the fear overtaking him in a wave. He had to get out. He had to keep moving. But no matter which way he turned, the forest closed in on him. The trees seemed to bend and lean, as if they were alive, watching him, guiding him deeper into the darkness. The voices grew louder. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape this place. His mind was unraveling, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring. Jack's thoughts were spiraling, his grip on sanity slipping with every step he took. The path in front of him seemed to twist in ways that made no sense. Paths appearing and disappearing, doors opening to more darkness. Then, just as Jack thought he couldn't run any longer, something appeared in front of him. A figure. A silhouette, standing in the middle of the forest, unmoving, its face obscured in shadows. Jack froze, his blood running cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch far beyond the limits of a human form. Its outline was vague, indistinct, but there was something undeniably terrifying about it. Something ancient. Something hungry. The figure didn't move, but Jack could feel its presence, looming over him like a storm cloud. It was the source of the whispers, the source of the eyes in the dark. He knew it deep down, and it was waiting for him. He tried to move, but his legs refused to respond. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the fear that gripped him. The figure was silent, but in the pit of Jack's stomach, he knew what was coming. It was going to claim him, take him into the darkness. He heard the voice again, this time clear and commanding. "You're mine now." And with that, the figure began to move toward him, its long, thin limbs reaching out. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. His body was frozen, and he could only watch as the dark figure grew closer, closer, until all he could see were the shadows swallowing him whole. The last thing Jack remembered was the feeling of cold, of a suffocating darkness pressing in, of something taking hold of him. And then everything went black. The unseen depths. When Jack opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. His body felt heavy, as if it were weighed down by an unseen force. His head was throbbing, the pain pulsating through his skull in sharp waves. His limbs felt like lead, and his vision was blurry, the darkness around him pressing in like a suffocating blanket. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. Panic surged through him as he realized he couldn't breathe properly. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere around him was alive, pressing in on him, choking him. His hands shot up to his neck, desperately clawing at something he couldn't see, something he couldn't understand. But there was nothing there. No visible threat. No physical restraints. And yet he couldn't breathe. He felt as though he was drowning in the darkness. The deeper he tried to breathe, the more it felt like something was smothering him, pulling him down into an abyss. In a final, desperate effort, Jack opened his eyes wide, fighting against the overwhelming sense of suffocation. What he saw made his stomach twist into knots. He was in a space, that was beyond anything he could comprehend. The shadows were everywhere, swirling around him, moving in unnatural ways. The ground beneath him seemed to shift with every movement, as if it were alive, breathing, responding to his every thought. The trees were gone. The road was gone. The car was gone. It was just him and the darkness. But the most unsettling part of it all? He wasn't alone. There were shapes, figures, hidden in the periphery of his vision, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. He could feel their eyes on him, a weight pressing down on his soul, as if they were watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. And then, a voice broke through the oppressive silence, a voice that seemed to come from all around him, a whisper that crawled into his mind like a parasite. "Did you really think you could escape, Jack?" The voice was cold, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. It was the same voice that had been following him since the very beginning, the voice that had whispered in the trees, the one that had haunted him through the darkness. The voice was laughing now, low, guttural, and terrifying. It echoed in the empty space, bouncing off unseen walls. There's nowhere left for you to go. You've entered my domain now, Jack. This is where you belong. Jack's breath quickened, panic clawing at his chest. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he reached out, searching for something, anything to hold on to. But the darkness only deepened. There was no escape, no light. The laugh grew louder, and Jack realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't in control of his own body anymore. His mind was trapped here, in this place, caught between the living world and whatever this thing was. He stumbled forward, disoriented, unsure of where he was even going. His feet carried him through the endless shadows, the cold air biting at his skin as he moved deeper into the unknown. His footsteps echoed through the void, each step growing heavier than the last. It felt as though the very ground was pulling him down, forcing him to sink into an unfeeling, infinite abyss. Jack's eyes flickered around him, desperate to make sense of the nightmare that had taken hold of him. And that's when he saw it. In the distance, far beyond the darkness, there was a faint glimmer of light. He didn't hesitate. His legs moved before his brain had even processed what he was doing. He sprinted toward the light, the warmth of it pulling him like a beacon. It wasn't much, but it was something. Anything was better than the suffocating void he was trapped in. But as he moved closer, the light seemed to flicker, as though it were being swallowed by the darkness itself. The closer he got, the further away it seemed. And then the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, like distant murmurs from a faraway place. But with every step, they grew louder, clearer. The whispers turned into words, into phrases, into commands. Words that Jack couldn't ignore. "Come closer, Jack," they said. "Come closer to the truth. You can't run. You can't hide." Jack's body froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt a cold chill run down his spine. There was something wrong with the light. It wasn't leading him to safety. It was leading him deeper into the darkness, into whatever twisted force had claimed this place. He stopped. He couldn't go any further. The voice was almost in his ear now, its whisper a cold, sharp blade against his skin. "You shouldn't have tried to escape. You belong to me now. Forever." And that's when Jack saw it. Emerging from the darkness, rising up from the shadows, was the thing that had been watching him all along. The tall, shadowy figure with long, twisted limbs. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form shifting and warping as it approached him. Jack's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure stopped just inches away from him, its hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide to be human. The stench of decay filled the air as the figure leaned closer, its breath like ice on Jack's skin. "You are mine now, Jack," the figure whispered, its voice filled with malice. "And you will never leave." The last thing Jack saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's face, a grotesque, twisted smile stretched across it, impossibly wide. The light flickered one last time, and then nothing. The endless night. Jack's world was nothing but darkness now. The light that had once beckoned to him, promising safety, was gone, swallowed up by the abyss. He tried to scream, but no sound left his mouth. His throat felt dry like sandpaper, and his limbs were frozen, paralyzed by a force far stronger than fear itself. He couldn't escape. He couldn't move. He was trapped. His mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. How had this happened? Was he dead? Was this purgatory? Or worse, had the thing, the shadowy figure, somehow claimed him, dragged his very soul into this suffocating, endless night? Jack didn't know. He didn't understand. All he knew was that he was alone, and that he was being hunted. The silence stretched out around him, so thick that it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on him from all sides. He could feel it, the weight of the void crushing him from within. It was as though he had fallen into a place that didn't exist, somewhere between reality and nightmare, where time didn't move, where no one could hear him scream. But then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was brief, like a shadow passing through his vision, but it was enough to make his pulse race again. He wasn't alone. Jack's heart pounded as he spun around, straining to see through the darkness, his breath coming in short gasps. His eyes darted, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that could lead him out of this nightmare. And there it was again, a shadow moving, shifting, just at the edge of his sight. It was slow, deliberate, like it was studying him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack's stomach churned with the realization that it wasn't just the one figure that was haunting him anymore. There were more. He didn't know how many there were, how far the shadows stretched, but he could feel them. Feel their presence all around him. It was as though they were watching him, closing in on him, 1,000 eyes in the dark, all waiting for the right moment to pounce. And then, that same whisper returned, low and guttural, wrapping around Jack's mind like a dark cloud. Do you see it, Jack? The endless night. You can't escape it. You belong here now. You always have. The voice was in his head, a constant, nagging presence that wouldn't let him forget. It knew his every fear, his every weakness. It used them against him, twisting his mind into knots. Jack's body trembled as he tried to move, to break free of the paralysis that held him in place. But no matter how hard he fought, his legs wouldn't respond. He was frozen in place, unable to escape the creeping horror that surrounded him. And then, through the endless darkness, Jack saw it. A figure. A shape, more distinct than the others, stepping out from the shadows. It was taller than the rest, its outline jagged, almost distorted. It moved with a strange grace, as if it didn't need to walk, as if it was floating, gliding toward him. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, cold and calculating. His breath hitched, his chest tightening as the figure drew closer, its presence suffocating him, like the air around him had thickened. Jack's body screamed in terror, but he couldn't move, couldn't run. The darkness had him, and he had no escape. The figure's lips parted, and the words that followed were like a dagger in his soul. "You're not alone, Jack," the voice rasped. "We are all here. You're one of us now." Jack's heart slammed into his chest, the fear so overwhelming that it threatened to crush him. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, couldn't understand how everything had spiraled so far out of control. But he knew one thing for certain now: he wasn't the one in control. He wasn't in charge of his fate anymore. The shadows, the darkness, the whispers, they controlled everything. And he was just a pawn in their game. The figure took a step closer, its long, twisted limbs reaching out toward him. Jack's body recoiled instinctively, but his feet were rooted to the ground. The thing's hand was inches away from his face, its fingers long and bony, like claws. "You've always been a part of this," it whispered, its breath cold against Jack's skin. "You just didn't know it." Jack's vision began to blur, the world around him spinning. His legs gave out, and he crumpled to the ground, his knees hitting the cold, unseen floor with a sharp thud. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. His body was numb, his mind lost in the endless night. The figure leaned down, its face now inches from his, the shadowy outline of its features forming into something monstrous. Its eyes were black, empty voids, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You can never leave," it said, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You belong to the darkness now. Forever." And just like that, the world went silent. The whispering, the figures, the fear, it all faded into a void, an empty blackness where there was nothing but the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. His mind was gone, lost to the darkness that had consumed him. The forgotten path. Time had no meaning in this place. Jack couldn't remember how long he had been trapped here, wandering the endless void. The sense of time itself had twisted and bent, stretched into something unrecognizable. Every moment felt like eternity, yet it also felt like nothing at all. The shadows pressed in on him, suffocating him from all sides. They were alive, creeping and slithering, their tendrils curling around him, dragging at his sanity. His mind screamed for release, but there was no escape. The dark was everywhere, and it was closing in. Jack had stopped trying to move long ago. He had stopped fighting. Every time he tried, his body would seize up, paralyzed by some unseen force. There was no strength left in him. His legs, once capable of running for miles, now felt like lead weights. His hands shook violently, and his head throbbed with the constant pressure of a headache that never went away. And still, he could feel them watching him. They were always there. The figures, the shadows, the whispers, they were his constant companions. He couldn't escape them. No matter how far he walked, they followed. It was as if the darkness itself had become part of him, binding him to this nightmarish world. And then, just when Jack thought he might lose his sanity entirely, he saw it. A flicker of light. It was distant at first, barely visible in the blackness that surrounded him. But as he stared at it, the light seemed to grow, to shift and pulsate, like a heartbeat in the void. It called to him, a beacon in the darkness, a promise of something other than the suffocating shadows. Jack's heart raced as he took a step forward, then another. His body was trembling with the effort, but he couldn't stop himself. The light beckoned, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. It was anything, that wasn't the darkness. The shadows tried to hold him back. He could feel their icy tendrils reaching for him, grasping at his limbs, pulling him down. But Jack ignored them. He had to reach the light. He had to escape. The light grew brighter, larger, until it consumed everything around him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack felt something other than fear. It was a glimmer of hope, a shred of life in a world that had long since lost its meaning. But as he stepped closer, something shifted. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, icy, unnatural. And as he walked closer, he could feel the ground beneath him change, becoming slick and uneven. The shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they swirled around him, merging with the light itself. And then the voice returned. "Do you think you can escape, Jack?" it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "This is where you belong. This is where you were always meant to be." Jack stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes darted around him, panic setting in. The light wasn't a salvation. It was another trap. The shadows closed in around him, their cold touch seeping into his skin, crawling beneath his flesh. Jack's breath hitched as he realized that he was trapped again, stuck in this twisted realm of darkness and light, a place where nothing was as it seemed. He backed away, his mind reeling. The figures were closing in, their distorted forms shifting in the corners of his vision, their eyes glowing with hunger. "You will never escape," the voice whispered again, louder this time. "You are part of this now. You are one of us." Jack's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his body shaking with a fear so intense it almost felt like a physical presence. His mind raced, searching for some way out, some way to break free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. But there was nothing. No way out. No way to escape. And then, as if on cue, the shadows around him seemed to dissolve, vanishing into the void. The air grew still, eerily quiet, as though the world itself had stopped turning. Jack looked up, confusion flooding his mind. The darkness had receded, leaving only the pale glow of the light in front of him. It flickered now like a dying star, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. And standing in the center of the light was a figure. It was tall, slender, and shrouded in a cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure's face was hidden, a shadowy void beneath the hood, but Jack could feel its presence, cold and unyielding, pressing against him like a physical force. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice low and smooth, almost soothing. "You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you, Jack? The moment when you would finally come face to face with what you've become." Jack's throat constricted, his chest tightening as the reality of the situation settled over him. He didn't want to know what this was, didn't want to hear the words that the figure was about to speak. But he had no choice. "You've been lost for so long," the figure continued, stepping closer to him. "But now you've found your place. You were always meant to be here, with us. You always belonged in the darkness." Jack's heart stuttered in his chest. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he couldn't. His body was no longer his own. His mind was slipping, being consumed by the very shadows that had haunted him from the start. The figure leaned in, its face still hidden in shadow. Jack could feel its breath, cold and damp, on his skin. "You belong to me now, Jack," the figure whispered. "You will never leave." And as the figure's cold hand reached out to touch him, Jack felt the last remnants of his sanity slip away, swallowed up by the infinite darkness that had claimed him. The final descent. The world around Jack was nothing but noise now. Not the kind of noise you could hear with your ears, but the kind that made its way deep inside your head. The kind that made your mind buzz and your thoughts scream in a cacophony of confusion. It was as if the very essence of reality was unraveling around him, and he was caught in the middle, helpless, unable to stop it. The figure's cold hand gripped Jack's arm, its fingers icy, as though they had never known warmth. The touch sent a shock of freezing terror through him, spreading through his veins like a poison, numbing him from the inside out. His body shook, not from the cold, but from the suffocating weight of fear. "You're still fighting it, aren't you?" the figure's voice whispered, its tone almost mocking. "It's futile. You're already here. There's no way out." Jack tried to pull away, but it was useless. His limbs were stiff, unresponsive, like they belonged to someone else. The more he struggled, the tighter the figure's grip became. The shadows seemed to close in on him, a silent, invisible force that wrapped around him, squeezing the life from him, suffocating him further with each passing second. "Don't resist," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You were always meant for this. You've always belonged to the dark. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening with each word. He didn't know what was worse, the darkness that surrounded him, or the fact that he was beginning to believe what the figure was saying. The shadows, the whispers, the cold grip, they were all real. This wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't something his mind had conjured up in a desperate attempt to escape reality. This was real. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. He had been running for so long, fighting so hard to escape, but it had all been in vain. There was no escape. There was no way out of this place. The darkness had consumed him, and now he was part of it. "Please," Jack begged, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "I don't want this. I don't want to be here." But the figure merely laughed, a low, cruel sound that seemed to echo through the void, vibrating against his skull. "It's too late for that, Jack," it said, its voice soft, almost pitying. "You've already made your choice. You chose to drive into the night, didn't you? You chose to ignore the warnings. You chose to seek the darkness. And now you belong to it." The words hit him like a blow, each one digging deeper into his mind, twisting it, breaking it. He had chosen. He had made the decision to drive down that empty road, to seek out the thrill of the unknown, and now he was paying the price. Jack's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the cold, unseen ground. The shadows closed in around him, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. He could feel them, surrounding him, crawling beneath his skin. His body was no longer his own. His mind was no longer his own. "You're one of us now," the figure repeated, its voice filled with a twisted satisfaction. "There is no turning back. There is only the dark." Jack wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat was dry, constricted, as if it were being choked by the very air around him. He could feel his consciousness slipping, his sense of self fading, being absorbed into the darkness. It was as if he were dissolving, piece by piece, becoming one with the very shadows that had haunted him from the beginning. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it any longer, the darkness paused. For a moment, everything went still. The whispers ceased. The shadows stopped moving. The figure's grip loosened, and Jack felt a strange calm settle over him, like a cold blanket wrapping itself around his mind. And in that moment of eerie quiet, Jack realized something. He was no longer afraid. The terror that had consumed him, the fear of the dark, the fear of being lost, of being trapped, had faded. He had surrendered to it. He had let go. In the darkness, he had found his peace. Jack's breathing slowed, his heart no longer racing in his chest. He felt a strange sense of clarity, like his mind had cleared of all the noise, all the confusion. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could think clearly. And then, with a final, almost imperceptible whisper, the figure spoke again. "You were always meant to be here." Jack didn't resist this time. He didn't fight it. He embraced the darkness, letting it consume him, knowing that it would be his eternal companion, his final destination. The figure vanished, and Jack was left alone in the black void. But he wasn't alone anymore. He was home. The endless road. There were no roads left to travel, no places left to visit. Jack was no longer the man who had once driven down that lonely highway, searching for something he couldn't define. He had become something else. Something that didn't belong to the world of the living or the dead. He was caught in the space between, a soul trapped in the endless expanse of the unknown. The darkness was no longer terrifying. It wasn't suffocating or claustrophobic. It was a part of him now, as natural as breathing, as essential as blood in his veins. He no longer needed to struggle or resist. The fear had slipped away, replaced by a cold acceptance of his fate. But as Jack stood in the void, he realized something. There was no escape. He had no purpose. No reason for being here. It was as if he had been abandoned in this place, left to drift in the vast emptiness with no direction, no goal. The silence weighed on him, pressing against him from all sides. It was more oppressive than the shadows, more overwhelming than the darkness. The silence was an absence of everything he had ever known, life, sound, color, time. It was like being trapped in a coffin with no way out, no way to break free. Jack had no idea how long he had been here, but the realization settled heavily on his chest. There was no end to this. He was in a place beyond time, beyond space, and there was no way to move forward or backward. The road was gone. The destination had been forgotten. But as he stood there, floating in the emptiness, a familiar sound reached his ears. A low rumble. At first, it was faint, like the sound of distant thunder. But then it grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a car. The engine's roar reverberated through the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The sound was the same as it had been that night, the night when everything had begun. The night when he had first driven down the highway, seeking the thrill of the unknown. But this was different. This wasn't just the sound of a car. It was something more, something darker, more sinister. The sound was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the void, surrounding him on all sides. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, but there was nothing. The darkness stretched out endlessly, with no sign of the car, no sign of the road. The rumbling grew louder, more intense, and Jack felt his pulse quicken in response. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence returned, suffocating and absolute. But this time, something was different. There was a presence in the air, a weight pressing down on Jack's chest, making it hard to breathe. The absence of sound was more unsettling than the noise had been. Jack didn't have time to process the change before something else happened. The ground beneath him trembled. The earth, if it could still be called that, shifted and cracked, as though the very foundation of reality was beginning to break apart. The darkness seemed to swirl, twisting in on itself, like it was alive and angry. The rumble returned, louder than ever. But now it was accompanied by a deafening screech. The sound of tires burning against asphalt. The unmistakable noise of a car skidding out of control. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to move, but his body was frozen. His legs refused to cooperate. He couldn't even bring himself to look away from the blackness around him, even as it began to take shape, forming the silhouette of a car, an old, rusted vehicle that he recognized all too well. It was the same car from that night. The car that had been behind him on the road, the one that had followed him all the way to this place. But now it was different. Its headlights were dim, flickering like dying stars. The car seemed to be alive, the engine roaring as if in pain, its tires screeching against the broken road. And then the car stopped. Jack could see it now, sitting in the darkness, as though waiting for something. The headlights flickered once more, and in the stillness of the void, Jack heard a voice. It was familiar. It was his own. "Come closer." The words were cold, distant, but they were unmistakable. His voice. Jack's voice. The car's door opened slowly, and the figure that stepped out was him. Only it wasn't him. It was a twisted version, a reflection of what he had become, an empty shell of the man he used to be. The figure's eyes glowed with a dull, lifeless light, and its mouth twisted into a sickening grin. It didn't speak again, but it didn't need to. The message was clear. Jack had become a part of the night, a part of the endless road, and he was now the thing that followed, the thing that hunted, the thing that never let go. The car's engine revved, and the figure turned to look at Jack. Its grin widened. "Your journey is far from over." The words echoed in Jack's mind as the car began to move again, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Jack didn't need to move. He didn't need to think. He was already in the car, already on the road, already lost to the night. And as the car sped into the void, Jack understood. He was now a part of the endless cycle. The road never ended. The night would never fade. The drive would go on forever. And he would be the one to keep driving. The eternal highway. The road stretched on forever, a never-ending ribbon of cracked asphalt that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. Jack didn't know how long he had been driving, or how long it had been since he last saw the world of the living. Time no longer had meaning here. It was just the road and him, and the endless expanse of blackness that surrounded him. There were no other cars, no signs, no lights. Just the sound of the engine roaring beneath him, the tires humming softly against the worn road, and the occasional flicker of the headlights. Every now and then the figure, his twisted reflection, would appear beside him, sitting silently in the passenger seat, its hollow eyes staring ahead unblinking. Jack had stopped questioning why it was there. He had stopped questioning anything. The confusion, the fear, the disbelief, it had all faded away, replaced by a cold, dull acceptance. This was his life now. This was his reality. There was no escape, no salvation. He had crossed the point of no return, and now he was bound to the road, bound to the darkness, bound to the never-ending night. "Where are we going?" Jack asked one night. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they slipped out before he could stop them. The figure turned to him, its grin as wide and empty as ever. "We're not going anywhere," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "We're already here." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had heard that before, but this time it carried a deeper meaning. The figure wasn't just speaking to him, It was speaking to the essence of his existence, to the truth he had been too afraid to face. This was where he belonged. The road didn't lead anywhere because it didn't need to. There was no destination, no end. The road was a loop, an infinite cycle that Jack was now a part of. He was both the driver and the passenger, the hunter and the hunted. He was trapped in the night, bound to its endless expanse, forced to drive, forced to keep going. But despite the inevitability of it all, Jack still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the fear anymore. It was something deeper. A hollow emptiness, a gnawing void in his chest that he couldn't fill. He glanced at the figure again, its face an unsettling mask of darkness. He couldn't even remember what it had looked like before all of this had begun. It was just another part of the darkness now, another piece of the puzzle that didn't make sense. How long? Jack asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. The figure didn't respond immediately. It just stared ahead, its fingers twitching ever so slightly. How long have I been driving? Jack repeated, the question now urgent, desperate. Does it matter? The figure's voice was sharp now, almost annoyed. Time doesn't exist here. Not in the way you think it does. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had to know. He had to understand. He had to find a way out of this. But there was no way out. The car continued down the road, and Jack continued driving, the engine's hum filling the void around him. His eyes were tired, his mind clouded, but he kept going, because that was all he knew how to do. Keep driving. The road, as far as he could see, was always the same. The cracks in the asphalt. The fading lines. The darkness that pressed in on all sides. There was no horizon, no end to the night. No stars in the sky, no moon to guide him. It was just the road and the endless black. And then, in the distance, Jack saw something. A flicker of light. A glimmer of hope, or so he thought. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. His heart began to race again, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his system. Was it another car? A sign? A glimpse of the world he had once known? The figure beside him shifted, its empty eyes locking onto the light. Its lips parted in a cruel smile. You think it's real? It asked, its voice dripping with disdain. You think that's a way out? Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, and the light grew closer, closer, closer still. The glow intensified, and for a moment he dared to believe that this was it, the end. The road was finally going to stop, and he would be free. But as he drew nearer, the light shifted, distorted, becoming something else entirely. The bright, blinding glow warped and twisted until it became a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. The figure was human, but only barely. Its face was obscured by shadows, its body nothing more than a silhouette against the light. And yet, Jack could feel it watching him, feel its eyes upon him as it slowly, deliberately moved toward the car. The car slowed, almost of its own accord. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was wading through thick, viscous air. And then it spoke. You've made your choice, it said, its voice low and familiar, but also foreign. The words seemed to echo through Jack's mind, reverberating in the emptiness. There is no way out. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure moved closer still. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real. A real presence standing before him. The figure's face became visible in the headlights. It was him. Or rather, it was a version of him. A twisted, broken reflection of the man he used to be. And then, in that moment, Jack understood. He had never left. He had never escaped. This was it. This was the end. But there was no end. There was only the road. The endless drive. The eternal night. Jack's car came to a stop. And then there was nothing.